Our next speaker is Eliza Murray from the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. Eliza is the Director of the Land Section Policy in that department and works largely in designing the carbon farming initiative. Eliza, please.
Okay, thanks. So I'm hoping today to go through a bit of the content of the Clean Energy Future Plan as it relates to the land sector, and then get into a bit more detail about the carbon farming initiative. So quite a few people in the room have made submissions, and I've spoken to a lot of you about the design of the scheme, and that feedback's been taken into account in designing it. We made quite a lot of changes in response to all the expert feedback we got on the first consultation round. At the moment, I'm going around the country doing some work with the land care facilitators to, I suppose, give them some of the background to be able to take that out on land. So I'll be in capital cities and able to meet with people if you'd like to have a chat about some more of the detail and what it means in your particular jurisdiction or region. We can arrange that as well. I've got my contact details on the last slide. So the Clean Energy Future package has numerous components in there. There's the carbon price mechanism, obviously, which is fixed price for now, and that's around about the top 500 biggest polluters will be paying a price on carbon. The light bulb represents improved energy efficiency measures. We've also got renewables, and where I'm focusing today is on the land sector, incentives to reduce emissions from the land sector. So as I mentioned, around about 500 of the biggest polluters will be paying the carbon price. Households aren't paying it directly. Agriculture is excluded, so they won't be paying for their emissions from livestock, from fertiliser use, and from off-road fuel. I'm sure that you've all heard plenty about it in the media, so I might just skip through this one. All the revenue from the carbon price is going back into climate change-related measures. 50% of it's going to households, and the remainder is being used to support jobs and competitiveness and invest in clean energy, and also those land sector packages. For all of what you may have heard in the news, I suppose this message hasn't come through all that strongly, but the average price increase is $9.90 a week for a household, and the average money that that household would be getting back is $10.10. You can see up there the relative cost, I suppose, compared to the GST. It's considerably smaller. So I might focus on what the implications are for regional Australia. First one, as I mentioned, agriculture is excluded. They don't have to count for their emissions. Light commercial vehicles and households don't have to pay for transport fuel. It's a big one in regional communities. Agriculture, fisheries and forestry don't have to pay for the carbon price on off-road fuel. Also don't have to pay for haulage until mid-2014. It's fuel for haulage. Obviously, haulage has its other expenses. And a big one, quite possibly the most valuable one in there, was that polluters, those 500 biggest emitters that will be paying the carbon price, can meet 5% of their obligation by buying CFI, Carbon Farming Initiative credits, rather than paying the tax. 5% might not sound a lot, but we really expect that to be around about supply. The implication being that CFI credits, the Kyoto CFI credits, will be selling for around about the carbon price of $23 a tonne. $200 million special assistance for energy efficiency of food processors and dairies. And the big one that I'll be talking about, $1.7 billion of carbon revenue to be invested in the land sector. And just for clarity, that's new money, that's carbon price revenue. It's not rebadging, caring for our country or the existing programs out there. This is what it looks like. $946 million over 6 years for biodiversity. That's a big bucket. I suppose I should talk a bit about the thinking behind that, how we got to this split of funds. The Biodiversity Fund had quite a few streams behind it, quite a few things that we were thinking about. One was top-up for CFI projects that might otherwise not have biodiversity benefits, but with an extra little push or a little bit of top-up could provide those benefits. So something like a monoculture forest to be able to turn that into a biodiverse or ecologically significant planting. Bit of top-up funding for that. CFI projects, well, projects that wouldn't happen under the CFI because the opportunity costs are too high. So, say a reforestation project wouldn't happen on a patch of land because the opportunity cost there was too high, but that is in a particularly important area for corridors. A third one, the areas where we don't have methodologies for counting the carbon yet, but we know that there are biodiversity and carbon benefits, and that would be something like restoring degraded wetlands or building new wetlands on private property. So we know that they have those benefits, but we don't know how to count the carbon, so we can't put it in the CFI just yet. We also have funding for managing and maintaining existing biodiverse carbon stores. They probably wouldn't be able to meet some of the eligibility requirements under the Carbon Farming Initiative, but we know that they provide a benefit. And I suppose the fifth main bundle in there would be managing invasive species. So as we're increasing connectivity, managing the spread of invasive species between areas. The second one's the CFI non-Kyoto fund. I'll come back to this split between Kyoto and non-Kyoto, but the Kyoto units can be traded in the compliance market. So they're the ones that the 500 biggest polluters can use to meet their obligations. The non-Kyoto ones they can't. And Ross Garnaut in his latest update made note of this and said this is basically an artificial division based on the Kyoto rules. Abatement is abatement regardless of whether it happens in a Kyoto project or a non-Kyoto project. And one of the ways the government's looking at evening that out is through this non-Kyoto purchase fund. So through that, non-Kyoto CFI credits can be sold to the government, which will push that price up and start to even out that discrepancy. And I should say as well, in the negotiations at the moment, the government is trying to even up those rules, so have more holistic land sector accounting, which will also address that issue. Carbon farming futures, $429 million. 4 streams under that, filling the research gap. So this is areas where we don't, so say like wetlands that I mentioned, also soil carbon, where we've got an idea that that there's carbon biodiversity or carbon benefits mainly in this one, but don't know how to account for it or aren't quite yet up to developing methodologies. The second one's developing the methodology, so where we've got the science, turning that into a methodology which sets out the rules for how you'd account for carbon and carry out a project under the CFI. Action on the ground, which I've been calling commercialisation. It's not really, I suppose, an appropriate word, but where we're somewhere between the research and actually having a CFI project up. So trialling things on ground, seeing if the measurement technologies work. And extension and outreach, which is the traditional extension, people on farms helping people do projects. NRM planning for climate change, $44 million. Some of you may have noticed in the CFI there's a requirement that project proponents take account of the relevant NRM plan. That's the CMAs here and in New South Wales and Vic. They have different names around the country, but that money, I suppose, is to help get the plans climate change ready on the mitigation side, so starting to have a bit more of a spatial focus about where in the landscape you could maximise the benefits from carbon projects, and also an adaptation side. So part of that money is directed towards providing information about impacts in a regionally relevant manner. Indigenous Carbon Farming Fund, that's partly for assistance for Indigenous communities and partly for technologies. One of the first cabs off the rank, I think, will be satellite monitoring of fire for savanna burning projects. Carbon Farming Skills is an accreditation scheme with training to get brokers and aggregators working in the carbon farming area up to speed, set them up as an accredited organisation. So we have heard a bit about snake oil sellers out there at the moment, but I suppose it's similar to hiring an electrician where you can get your mate down the road to do it, or you can actually go to someone who's got the accreditation and have that extra assurance. The last bit in there is the Land Sector Carbon and Biodiversity Board, and that's part of the governance structure around these measures. So I might just quickly go into governance. The Land Sector Carbon and Biodiversity Board will be having a bit of an overview role, making sure that research isn't duplicated, providing advice to ministers. At the next level down, we've got I'm not sure if they're calling it an IDC or a steering committee, but we've got some of the exec from DAF, environment and climate change working together on these measures to make sure they all work well together. And then at the next level down, we've got officers in touch regularly on these. So the Biodiversity Fund will be administered by the Environment Department. I understand that the people who did the Environmental Stewardship Program are having a lot to do with that at the moment. The CFI Non-Kyoto Carbon Fund will be administered in climate change. Carbon farming futures is in DAF, except for developing methodologies, which is in climate change. NRM planning for climate change is also split between SOPAC doing the assisting with the plans and climate change doing the adaptation component. Indigenous carbon farming is with climate change, as is carbon farming skills, and the Secretariat for the Land Sector Carbon and Biodiversity Advisory Board will be in SOPAC as well. So I might move on now to the Carbon Farming Initiative. Can I get a sense of how much everyone's had to do with it? Who doesn't know what the CFI is about? That's probably the easiest way. Yeah, a couple of people? All right, I'll go from scratch. It was announced as an election commitment, and there were 3 streams in there. One was the carbon trading, the mechanism for allowing landholders to generate carbon credits. There was a bit of money for developing methodologies and also some funding for getting information products out. The main bit, I suppose, the bit that I've had the most to do with is the mechanism for allowing landholders to generate credits. That's a legislative scheme. It's been passed through the House of Representatives and it's being debated at the moment in the Senate, so we're expecting it to be reintroduced in August and debated then. Hopefully they'll come to a decision and we'll be able to get the scheme rolling later this year. So it allows landholders to earn carbon credits for reducing emissions from agriculture and land use change, increasing the carbon stored in soils and vegetation, and that covers both Kyoto and non-Kyoto projects, as I mentioned before. So people and businesses can then buy the CFI credits to offset their emissions. The Kyoto ones can be sold either domestically or internationally in the compliance and the voluntary market. The voluntary market is largely around carbon neutrality, also people ticking the box on when they take a flight. The compliance market is the people who have the obligations under the carbon price mechanism. So the kind of projects that we're talking about are reforestation, revegetation, soil carbon projects, livestock management, manure and methane management, and feral animal management. Sort of some of the bigger bundles of projects. The scheme's been set up with to allow innovation, so there's a whole lot of other potential projects out there that we haven't thought of yet that could still come through the CFI, but some of the more prospective ones are the ones that the government's been working on methodologies for, which is savanna burning, environmental plantings, management of manure in piggeries, and landfill gas management. We've also had one private proponent one for camel culling, and they're all up on the website if anyone wants to see them in more detail. So the scheme mechanics, this is, I suppose, a quick overview of what the scheme looks like. Methodology approval is the main thing. So the methodology sets out the instructions for carrying out a project, the monitoring and verification, and the method for calculating or estimating the abatement that results, so the amount of carbon. They can be developed by anyone. Government's developing some at the moment, but we've also had some developed by private proponents. We're aware that some industry organisations and academic or research institutions are looking to it as well. Once they're submitted, they're released for public comment for 40 days, and then they can be assessed by an independent committee called the Domestic Offsets Integrity Committee, the DOIC, and then approved by the Minister for use in the scheme. So for project approval, you can either use a methodology that's already been developed, or you can go through the process of developing one. Once they're developed, they're publicly available. To have an approved project, you need to be a fit and proper person, which basically means that you don't have fraud charges against you, those sort of things. It's not about how good you are on the treadmill. You need to meet a few other scheme requirements that I'll come to in a minute. And then your project is declared an eligible project and you can go off and do it. You can report on your project anywhere between 1 year and 5 years, and when you report is when you get your credits. So the credits are issued after the abatement occurs. which probably covers off crediting. The administrator will issue Kyoto or non-Kyoto units, depending on your type of project. Some projects will have half and half as well. And the last stage, termination and transfer. So you can either terminate your project, which is quite easy to do for a emissions reduction project. It's a little bit more complicated for sequestration projects because there's a permanence arrangement, which I'll come to in a minute as well. But yeah, I might cover that off on the next slide. So, okay, I might have to fly through this. The integrity principles, so the scheme's based around these principles to make sure that the carbon that we're issuing credits for is genuinely equivalent to carbon that it's offsetting. Measurable, fairly obvious, you need to have a methodology for counting the carbon. Conservative, to make sure that each credit is worth at least 1 tonne of abatement. Based on peer-reviewed science, again, fairly self-explanatory. Internationally consistent is about making sure that it relates to our international accounts, so what we report against our Kyoto Protocol commitments, and it would allow our market to link internationally. Additional is a big one, so that's making sure that something is beyond common practice or beyond what would occur in the absence of the CFI. Important part of making sure that the credits are issued for abatement that genuinely offsets. So this has been quite a difficult one for people working in or people who are used to receiving grants where additionality isn't as much a concern. I suppose the way that I've been explaining it is that if you're trying to offset your emissions but you're paying for something that would otherwise happen anyway, all you're doing is subsidising that activity. It's not a genuine benefit to the atmosphere that can really cancel out your emissions. Permanence, this relates to the biosequestration activity, so it doesn't relate to those emissions reductions projects, but for sequestration projects where you're storing the carbon in the landscape, you need to maintain it for 100 years. That's the internationally accepted permanent time frame. But you can still change land use, so you can return credits if you wanted to change your land use and, say, remove trees that you'd planted. Avoidance of leakage is another one. So leakage is the idea that if you destock on your property, sure, the emissions have reduced on your property, but if your neighbour just increases their stock levels because the demand hasn't changed, then there's no benefit to the atmosphere. So you have to account for leakage. 2 parts of the additionality test. The project's not required by law and it's on the positive list. Positive list is a list of activities that are deemed to go beyond common practice and be additional. There's a consultation paper on the website. The process is closed, but I'm happy to speak to anyone about that in more detail. Avoiding impacts. This is one that is a bit of a theme for the workshop, I gather, so I might just pause here for a minute. We've got a negative list. We didn't start with that when we were designing the scheme. We were saying as long as you comply with the regulation of all levels of government, that's good enough. The feedback that we had was that this new incentive is going to be in before the planning regimes and regulation can catch up, so we need some other mechanism for making sure there's no adverse impacts. So where there is a significant risk of an impact on biodiversity, water or communities, we're looking at listing those activities as ineligible in those circumstances. Projects still have to have the necessary approvals of all levels of government, and projects have to take account of the relevant NRM plan. We've also got co-benefits. I've put this on the same slide because when we started talking about positive list and negative list, people thought that negative list was bad stuff, positive list was the good stuff, but that's quite different. Positive list relates to additionality, co-benefits relates to the extra good stuff. So in regulations we'll have a standard in inverted commas for projects to be able to report that they have gone the extra mile to provide biodiversity benefits. That's basically an information measure so that the buyers who are willing to pay a bit more can seek out those types of projects to buy their credits from, and they'll sell at a premium. At the moment we're looking at interactions between carbon and conservation programs. These are some of the types that we're looking at, but I think I'm running out of time, so I might just skip to one point that I wanted to make about the interaction between vegetation offsets and carbon offsets. There's been a lot of talk around, I know Brendan Wintle and colleagues have written about allowing multiple income streams for landholders, doing, I suppose, good stuff for the environment. But what that actually means when you start talking about trading into separate markets, there's a few issues that need to be resolved. So I suppose that one of the issues is being clear about what it is that you're buying. So this aside for now, are you buying an action or are you buying an outcome? If you're buying an outcome, are you buying carbon or biodiversity or both? Where we've got native vegetation offsets, I suppose I might have to project but point to the slide for a minute. So if this is your new project, so this has been done as an offset project, this has been done as an offset project and gaining biodiversity and carbon. It's then selling its biodiversity as a veg offset down here where the land's been cleared, except that that project where the land's been cleared has also lost carbon. But it's also trading its carbon into this market over here. You've got a net loss of carbon in the system. So it's really important to be very clear about what it is that you're requiring to be offset. At the moment, we're looking at having some interactions where you do have a loss of carbon, but I'm not sure how we get around that, and I'm very keen to explore that idea with people in the room and others who might be interested. So, as I mentioned before, contact details, you can catch me at cfi@climatechange.gov.au. That's the main website for the scheme for the CFI. The Clean Energy Future is on a separate website if you need that information as well. Thank you.